A young boy slave was fixing her bed when she uttered the words that would shatter his world. "You're handsome, you know that?" In the brutal hierarchy of the plantation, a single forbidden compliment crossed the line that separated owner from property. What followed wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. When power and forbidden attraction collide, the price is always paid in blood. Elijah had mastered the art of invisibility by 16. Eyes down, movements silent, existence forgotten. On the Montgomery plantation, being noticed meant pain, or worse. For 3 years, he'd perfected this disappearing act, becoming nothing more than a shadow moving through the grand house, a ghost among the living, present only to serve, then vanish again. "Boy, Miss Charlotte's quarters need attending." The housekeeper's voice cracked like a whip across the kitchen, making the younger house slaves flinch. Mrs. Holloway ruled the indoor staff with iron discipline and a memory that forgave nothing. Elijah nodded once, his face carefully blank. "Yes, ma'am." The master's daughter had returned from her northern schooling 2 weeks ago, bringing strange ideas and restless energy that unsettled the entire household. Whispers traveled through the slave quarters about Miss Charlotte questioning her father at dinner, about books hidden in her trunks that no Southern lady should read, about her refusal to accept certain traditions. He'd glimpsed her only from afar, a flash of golden hair catching sunlight through windows, the rustle of expensive fabric around corners, a laugh too loud and free for proper society. The other house slaves gave her room a wide berth when possible. Something about her was different, unpredictable, dangerous. That morning, he entered her room as he always did, invisible. The chamber smelled of lavender water and paper, nothing like the cloying perfumes the other ladies preferred. Head bowed, he methodically replaced linens, straightened furniture, and swept the floor with practiced efficiency. The ornate 4-poster bed frame had loosened at one corner. He noticed the slight wobble as he changed the sheets. Elijah knelt to tighten it, his fingers working quickly at the joints. The wood was expensive mahogany, imported like everything else the Montgomerys owned. His father had been a skilled carpenter before being sold away when Elijah was 7. These small repairs were one of the few connections he still had to the man whose face grew dimmer in his memory each year. He didn't hear her enter. The thick carpet muffled her footsteps, and he was lost in concentration, in the momentary peace of working with his hands. "You're handsome, you know that?" The words froze him like ice water dumped down his spine. No white woman had ever spoken to him this way. It simply wasn't done. His hands trembled against the wooden frame as terror and confusion flooded his body. Every instinct screamed danger. Looking up meant death. Not looking up meant disrespect. There was no safe choice, no correct response to this impossible situation. When he finally raised his eyes, Charlotte Montgomery was watching him with a curious expression. Not the disgust or detachment he expected, but something far more dangerous: interest. She stood in the doorway, a book clutched to her chest, wearing a simple blue dress that would have been plain on anyone else. On her, it looked deliberate, a rejection of Southern excess. "Miss, His voice failed him. His throat closed around words that could get him killed. "You don't have to be afraid," she said, stepping closer. The floorboards creaked beneath the carpet. "I'm not like them." But she was. The same blood ran through her veins as the master who had ordered a man whipped to death last spring for looking at a white woman too long. The same privilege wrapped around her like an invisible cloak, protecting her from consequences while he lived and died by her family's whims. And they both knew it. "I'm nearly finished, miss," he managed, eyes dropping back to the floor where they belonged. The bed frame needed tightening. "What's your name?" she asked, ignoring his attempt to return to invisibility. The question hung between them, deceptively simple yet loaded with danger. Names had power. Names meant recognition. Names turned property into people. "Elijah," he whispered, the admission feeling like a stone dropping into still water, ripples spreading outward beyond his control. "Elijah," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "Thank you for fixing my bed, Elijah." As he fled the room that day, heart hammering against his ribs, tools clutched in white-knuckled hands, he couldn't know that Charlotte's impulsive words weren't just dangerous for him. They would awaken something in her that threatened everything her family stood for, and everything that kept him alive. That night, lying sleepless on his thin pallet in the cramped quarters he shared with 5 others, Elijah replayed those moments again and again. He knew better than to mention the encounter to anyone. Old Joseph, who had survived 60 years on plantations, always said that dangerous knowledge was best buried deep. But as dawn approached, bringing another day of servitude, Elijah realized with growing dread that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in years, he had been seen, not as property, but as a person. And nothing was more dangerous on the Montgomery plantation than being truly seen. Charlotte Montgomery had never considered herself rebellious until she spent 2 years at Miss Porter's school in Connecticut. There, among daughters of abolitionists and suffragettes, she discovered that the world she knew was built on carefully constructed lies. The return to her father's plantation felt like stepping back into a stifling dream, where everyone performed their roles without question. "You've changed, Charlotte," her father had observed over dinner their first night, his tone making it clear this wasn't a compliment. His eyes, the same piercing blue as her own, had assessed her with the cool calculation he typically reserved for evaluating livestock or new property. She'd simply smiled and cut her meat with deliberate precision. "Education tends to have that effect, Father." The silence that followed had spoken volumes. Her mother had nervously filled it with chatter about the latest fashions from Paris, while her younger sister Catherine had watched the exchange with wide eyes, still too young at 14 to understand the subtle warfare taking place across the polished mahogany. Now, alone in her room, after her encounter with Elijah, Charlotte paced the floor, her thoughts racing like wild horses. The thick carpet muffled her footsteps as she moved from window to bed, to writing desk and back again. She hadn't planned to speak to him. The words had simply escaped her lips before she could stop them. But they were true. Unlike the other house slaves who kept their eyes downcast and moved with practiced caution, there was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. A spark not yet extinguished by the systematic crushing of spirit that her father called proper management. Charlotte paused at the window, looking out over the manicured gardens where her mother's prized roses bloomed in careful rows. Beyond them stretched the cotton fields, and further still, the cluster of simple cabins where the field hands lived. She had never been allowed to visit that part of the plantation. "No place for a lady," her father had always insisted. Now she understood his real concern was that she might see too clearly the suffering that purchased their privilege. She picked up her journal, bound in soft leather, that had been a parting gift from her northern roommate, Abigail. Opening to a fresh page, she hesitated, pen hovering above the blank expanse. How could she possibly capture the complexity of what she'd felt in that moment when Elijah's eyes had met hers? Her northern friends would be scandalized by her thoughts, but for entirely different reasons than her southern family would be. The abolitionists spoke of slaves as abstract victims to be saved. not as individuals with their own beauty and complexity. Neither perspective allowed for what she had just experienced. A moment of genuine human recognition that had left her breathless. After several false starts, she wrote simply, "Today, I saw someone truly for the first time. Not as my father's property, but as a man with thoughts and feelings as real as my own. I spoke without thinking and may have endangered us both. Yet I cannot bring myself to regret it." The dinner bell rang, its clear tone cutting through her reflections. Charlotte closed the journal and tucked it beneath her mattress, a hiding place as childish as it was necessary. Her father expected punctuality, especially now that he was watching for signs of her northern corruption, as he called it, when he thought she couldn't hear. She glanced in the mirror, smoothing her hair and pinching color into her cheeks. Her dress, a modest blue cotton that would have been unremarkable in Connecticut, had already drawn disapproving glances from her mother, who preferred her daughters draped in silks and lace regardless of the oppressive heat. But Charlotte had returned with more than just ideas. She had developed a taste for simplicity that felt like quiet rebellion against Southern excess. Downstairs, the dining room gleamed with polished silver and crystal, a shrine to Montgomery prosperity. Candles flickered in silver holders, casting dancing shadows across the damask wallpaper. Her mother sat rigidly at one end of the table, already sipping her first glass of wine. 3 place settings waited on the white tablecloth, the fourth, Catherine's, conspicuously absent. "Charlotte, darling," her mother said with practiced warmth that never quite reached her eyes. "Your father tells me Thomas Wilkes will be joining us this evening." Charlotte's stomach tightened, as if cinched by invisible corset strings. Thomas Wilkes was 35, a widower with political ambitions and 3 plantations larger than her father's. His first wife had died in childbirth the previous year, along with the infant. His interest in Charlotte had been clear even before she left for school, though she had been barely 17 then. "How thoughtful of father to arrange company without informing me," she replied, taking her seat and arranging her napkin with exaggerated care. Her mother's smile thinned, the lines around her mouth deepening. At 42, Eleanor Montgomery remained beautiful. Though the years of Southern summers and the strain of maintaining perfect appearances had begun to etch themselves into her face. A lady should always be prepared for guests. Perhaps if you spent less time with your books and more time on your appearance. The criticism hung in the air as the door opened. Elijah entered with a silver tray of glasses, his face now an expressionless mask, so perfect it might have been carved from dark wood. Charlotte felt heat rise to her cheeks as he moved silently around the table, filling water glasses without meeting anyone's gaze. His fingers, she noticed, were long and graceful, moving with precision that spoke of natural dexterity. "That will be all?" Her mother dismissed him with a wave, not bothering to look at him directly. Charlotte watched him disappear through the service door, wondering if their earlier interaction had been a dream. The contrast between the young man who had looked at her with such startled humanity and this carefully blank servant made her chest ache with a feeling she couldn't name. Shame, perhaps, or something dangerously close to anger. "Where is Catherine this evening?" she asked, desperate to direct her thoughts elsewhere. "Your sister has a slight fever. Mrs. Holloway is tending to her," her mother replied. "Nothing serious. But we thought it best she rest, especially with Mr. Wilkes visiting." Charlotte nodded, relieved for her sister's sake. Catherine was still innocent enough to be impressed by Thomas Wilkes's fortune and position. She didn't yet recognize the calculating ambition behind his charm. The main doors opened with a flourish as her father entered with Thomas Wilkes close behind, both men laughing at some shared joke. Her father, Colonel James Montgomery, cut an imposing figure at 53, his military bearing undiminished by age or civilian life. Beside him, Thomas Wilkes looked almost slight, though he stood nearly as tall. What he lacked in physical presence, he made up for with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. Thomas's eyes immediately found Charlotte, sweeping over her with proprietary interest that made her skin crawl. "Miss Montgomery?" He bowed slightly, taking her reluctantly offered hand and holding it a moment too long. "You grow more lovely each time I see you. Connecticut clearly agreed with you, though we're all grateful to have you back where you belong." "Mr. Wilkes?" she acknowledged, her voice cooler than propriety demanded as she withdrew her hand. "How kind of you to join us this evening." Her father's warning glance wasn't lost on her as they all took their seats. The first course arrived, a turtle soup that had been one of Charlotte's favorites before she left. Now the rich broth turned her stomach slightly as she thought of the kitchen slaves who had been preparing this meal since dawn. "Thomas has just returned from Charleston," her father announced as they began eating. "The mood there is quite determined. Governor Gist believes secession may be inevitable if Lincoln wins the election." "Surely it won't come to that," Charlotte's mother murmured, clearly uncomfortable with political talk at her dinner table. Thomas dabbed his mouth with his napkin. "I'm afraid it very well might, Mrs. Montgomery. The North grows more radical by the day. Their newspapers openly call for the destruction of our way of life." As the men discussed cotton prices and political tensions with the North, Charlotte found her thoughts drifting back to Elijah. What would happen to him if the conflict her father and Mr. Wilkes dismissed as northern aggression came to pass? What would happen to all of them? The conversation she'd overheard at school suggested that war, if it came, would be neither quick nor merciful. "Charlotte has become quite the reader during her time away," her father was saying, drawing her attention back to the conversation. His tone carried that peculiar mixture of pride and disapproval he'd perfected over the years. Perhaps too much so. Thomas Wilkes smiled indulgently, revealing teeth too perfect to be natural. "A little education is charming in a woman, so long as it doesn't interfere with her true duties. My late wife was accomplished in French and music, but never let it distract her from managing the household." Charlotte took a sip of water, noting with private satisfaction that it was Elijah who had poured it. "And what do you believe a woman's true duties are, Mr. Wilkes?" she asked, ignoring her mother's warning glance. The question hung in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm. Her father's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Her mother's fingers tightened visibly around her wine glass. Charlotte knew she was treading dangerous ground, but the memory of Elijah's eyes meeting hers, human to human, gave her a reckless courage she might otherwise have suppressed. To bring beauty and comfort to her husband's life, of course, Thomas replied smoothly, though a slight tightening around his eyes suggested her question had discomfited him. To raise children who understand their place in the world, to maintain the social order that benefits us all. "All of us?" Charlotte pressed, the words escaping before wisdom could contain them. Her father set down his fork with deliberate care, the soft clink against fine china somehow more threatening than a shout would have been. "Charlotte, perhaps you could check on dessert. I believe Mrs. Holloway mentioned a special syllabub in honor of Mr. Wilkes's visit." It wasn't a suggestion. Charlotte rose, feeling 3 pairs of eyes following her as she left the dining room. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, breathing deeply to calm her racing heart. What was wrong with her? 2 years away had not just changed her thoughts, but loosened her tongue in ways that could only bring trouble. Her father's patience, never abundant, was clearly wearing thin. A movement caught her eye. Elijah, carrying a tray of dessert plates toward the dining room. For a brief moment, their eyes met again. This time, she saw something new in his gaze. Caution, certainly, but also curiosity. Perhaps even a flicker of respect. He passed by without a word, maintaining the invisible barrier between them. But Charlotte knew something had fundamentally changed. 5 simple words had created a dangerous connection that neither of them had sought, but that now seemed impossible to sever. "Miss Charlotte." Mrs. Holloway appeared from the kitchen, her substantial frame blocking the hallway. "Your father sent for you?" "He wanted me to check on dessert," Charlotte replied, straightening her posture. The housekeeper's expression suggested she didn't believe this explanation for a moment, but years of service had taught her discretion. "It's ready to be served. Shall I tell him you're returning?" Charlotte nodded, smoothing her skirts and preparing to face the consequences of her impertinence. As she composed herself to return to dinner, she realized with sudden clarity that words, once spoken, could never truly be taken back. They lived on in the space between people, creating invisible bridges that could either save or destroy. And she had no idea which outcome awaited them. When she re-entered the dining room, the conversation had shifted to safer territory. The upcoming harvest ball at the Wilkinsons' plantation. Her mother's relief was palpable as Charlotte took her seat without further provocation. "Thomas has graciously offered to escort you to the ball," her father informed her, his tone making it clear this was decided rather than proposed. Charlotte looked across the table at Thomas Wilkes, whose smile reminded her of the alligators that lurked in the swamps beyond the plantation. Patient predators, confident their prey had nowhere to escape. "How thoughtful," she managed, as Elijah appeared at her elbow with the syllabub, a confection of whipped cream and wine that had once delighted her childish palate. As he served her, his sleeve brushed against her shoulder, the lightest of touches, possibly accidental. But in that brief contact, Charlotte felt a jolt of awareness that made the fine hairs on her arms rise. When she glanced up, his expression remained perfectly neutral, revealing nothing. "Thank you," she said quietly, the simple courtesy earning her another sharp look from her father. One did not thank property for performing its function. This was another rule she had forgotten, or chosen to disregard. Thomas Wilkes watched the interaction with narrowed eyes, missing nothing. "Colonel," he said after Elijah had left the room, "I've been meaning to compliment you on your staff. Well-trained servants are increasingly rare these days." "Discipline is essential," her father replied, "particularly with the troubling ideas spreading from the north. I've had to make examples more frequently than I'd like." Charlotte's appetite vanished entirely as she understood the meaning behind her father's words. The whipping post stood in full view of the slave quarters, a deliberate reminder of the consequences of disobedience. "Indeed," Thomas agreed, his gaze sliding to Charlotte. "The young must be taught proper respect for tradition, whether they be servants or family." The threat, however veiled, was unmistakable, as Charlotte forced herself to take a bite of the too-sweet dessert. She realized that she had underestimated the danger, not just to herself, but to Elijah. In the world of the Montgomery plantation, even the smallest kindness across the color line could be interpreted as insurrection, and insurrection was punishable by death. Elijah's hands trembled as he scrubbed the dinner plates in the kitchen. The evening had stretched his nerves to breaking point. First, the unexpected encounter with Miss Charlotte in her bedroom, then serving dinner while pretending nothing had changed. Worst of all was overhearing the Colonel's casual mention of making examples. Thomas Wilkes looked on with approval. The words had settled in Elijah's stomach like stones, heavy with implicit threat. The kitchen was stifling despite the late hour, heat radiating from the cast-iron stove where tomorrow's bread would rise overnight. Sweat trickled down his back as he methodically cleaned each piece of the Montgomery's fine china, imported from England at great expense, as Mrs. Holloway reminded the kitchen staff whenever they handled it. One broken plate could mean a whipping, one chipped teacup could mean missed meals. The monetary value of each piece far exceeded what most slaves would earn if they worked their entire lives as free people. "You sick, boy?" Mrs. Holloway asked sharply, noticing his distraction. The housekeeper missed nothing in her domain. At 58, she had survived 3 generations of Montgomery masters by being more vigilant than they were, by anticipating problems before they arose. Her position offered relative comfort, but demanded absolute loyalty to the family above her own people. "No, ma'am," he replied, steadying his hands through sheer force of will. "Just tired." She studied him with narrowed eyes, the deep lines in her dark face testifying to decades of watching and waiting and enduring. "Well, finish up those plates proper. No time for tiredness when there's work to be done." Her tone softened almost imperceptibly. "And mind you don't cut yourself on that cracked one. Master's been in a mood since Miss Charlotte came home." The warning was clear. Mrs. Holloway had seen something, perhaps in his expression when serving Miss Charlotte, perhaps in the way the Colonel had watched him. She wouldn't ask directly. Direct knowledge was too dangerous. But she had survived by sensing trouble before it arrived, and now she sensed it around Elijah. "Yes, ma'am," he murmured, focusing intently on the plate in his hands, a delicate thing with hand-painted roses around the edge. He wondered briefly about the hands that had created it. Were they free hands? Did the artist ever imagine their work would be touched by someone who was considered property, just as the plate was property? The kitchen buzzed with activity as the house slaves completed their evening duties. Lucy, a girl barely 13, swept the floor while humming softly to herself, a tuneless melody that somehow made the work seem lighter. She had been brought up from the fields just 2 months ago when the previous housemaid had been sold to cover the Colonel's gambling debts. Her eyes still held the wary look of someone expecting to be sent back at any moment. Old Samuel polished silver with meticulous care in the corner, his arthritic fingers somehow still managing the delicate work. At 70, he was the oldest slave on the plantation, and the only one who remembered the Colonel's father. This gave him a certain status, though it wouldn't protect him if he became too infirm to work. In the corner, Bessie nursed her infant while preparing tomorrow's bread dough, her movements efficient despite her exhaustion. The baby, just 6 weeks old, had been allowed to stay with her only because Mrs. Montgomery believed it improved the quality of Bessie's cooking to keep her settled. The Colonel had wanted to send the infant to the quarters to be raised by the older women who cared for the slave children while their parents worked the fields. None of them spoke about what they'd overheard from the dining room. Dangerous knowledge was best kept silent. Words had power, power to comfort, but also power to condemn. In the slave quarters, parents taught their children early, "Keep your thoughts behind your teeth. Let your face tell the master's story, not your own." When Elijah finally finished his tasks, the grandfather clock in the hallway was striking 11. His body ached for sleep, but his mind raced with thoughts of Miss Charlotte, the way she'd thanked him at dinner, a small act that could bring punishment to them both. The Colonel had noticed. So had Thomas Wilkes, The memory of Wilkes's calculating gaze made Elijah's skin crawl. There was something predatory in the way the man watched both him and Miss Charlotte, as if they were pieces in a game only he understood. Elijah carefully hung the damp cloth over the drying rack, nodding good night to Mrs. Holloway, who would be the last to leave the kitchen. As head housekeeper, she slept in a small room off the main house rather than in the quarters. It was a privilege that separated her from the others. Another way the masters kept their slaves divided, preventing the solidarity that might threaten their control. Outside, the night air offered temporary relief from the kitchen's heat. Stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt, indifferent to the human drama below. Crickets chirped in the darkness, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird called its night song. Elijah paused, allowing himself a moment to breathe before heading to the slave quarters. These brief moments of solitude were precious, perhaps the only time he truly belonged to himself. Elijah. The whispered name froze him in place. Miss Charlotte stood in the shadow of the garden trellis, a dark shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Moonlight caught in her hair, turning it silver. Against the backdrop of climbing roses, she looked like something from another world, a spirit or vision rather than flesh and blood. Every instinct screamed for him to flee, to pretend he hadn't heard. Nothing good could come from a white woman seeking out a slave in darkness. Men had been killed for less, much less. Yet his feet refused to move. Instead, he found himself moving toward her, drawn by some force he couldn't name, couldn't fight. "Miss, you shouldn't be out here," he whispered when he was close enough. The scent of lavender reached him, her signature scent, so different from the heavy perfumes preferred by Southern ladies. "If someone sees—" "I had to speak with you," she interrupted. Her voice held an urgency that silenced his objections. In the moonlight, her eyes appeared almost colorless, wide with emotion. "My father and Mr. Wilkes. I'm afraid they suspect something." Elijah felt cold despite the warm night, fear sliding down his spine like ice water. "Suspect what, miss? There's nothing to suspect." He tried to keep his voice steady, reasonable, though his heart hammered against his ribs. Even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Something had formed between them, fragile and undefined, but real enough to be dangerous. A recognition, perhaps, an acknowledgement of each other's humanity in a place designed to deny it. And in the Montgomery plantation, such recognition was a threat to the very foundations of their world. Charlotte glanced toward the main house, her profile sharp against the darkness. A single light still burned in the colonel's study window. "My father mentioned making examples. I've seen what that means." She turned back to him, eyes bright with emotion that might have been tears. "I couldn't bear it if you were punished because of me." The concern in her voice was so genuine, it made his chest ache. White folks didn't worry about the pain of slaves. It simply wasn't done. Pain was a tool, a necessity, like the plow or the cotton gin. Yet here she stood, risking her reputation and safety because she feared for him. The realization was disorienting, like the ground shifting beneath his feet. "Miss Charlotte," he said carefully, aware that every word might be his undoing. "You need to forget what happened this morning, for both our sakes." He glanced toward the quarters where he should already be, where his absence might soon be noticed. "Some things can't be changed. Not by you, not by me." "I can't," she replied simply, her chin lifting with a stubborn determination he was beginning to recognize. "I've spent 2 years learning to see clearly, Elijah. I can't go back to blindness." A night bird called from the darkness, its cry like a warning. From the direction of the fields, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Elijah shifted uneasily, aware that every moment they spent together increased the danger exponentially. The night had eyes, slaves who might report to curry favor, white overseers making their rounds, even family members who might glimpse them from a window. "There are things you don't understand about this place," he said finally, choosing his words with care. "About what happens to people who forget their place." He didn't specify which people. He didn't need to. They both knew the consequences fell hardest on those with the least power. Charlotte stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent of her hair, could see the small scar above her right eyebrow. A childhood injury, perhaps. "Then help me understand. I have books, ideas, but I need to know the truth, your truth." The request stunned him. No one had ever asked for his truth before. The very concept was foreign, dangerous. Slaves were not permitted truths of their own, only the narratives assigned to them by their masters. To speak his truth would be to claim a self separate from his status as property. It would be an act of rebellion more profound than any physical resistance. Before he could respond, a light appeared in an upstairs window of the house, the colonel's bedroom. Charlotte noticed it too and stepped back quickly, the spell of intimacy broken by imminent danger. "My father," she whispered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I must go. But please." She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pressed something into his hand. The paper was warm from her body, soft from handling. "If you're willing, leave a sign. 3 stones by the old oak behind the kitchen garden. I'll check tomorrow." Then she was gone, a shadow melting into darkness, leaving Elijah with his heart pounding and a folded piece of paper burning in his palm like a coal. He stood frozen until he was certain she had safely re-entered the house, then quickly tucked the paper into his shoe, the only place he could think to hide it. The walk to the slave quarters seemed longer than usual. Each step weighted with the knowledge that he carried something forbidden. The quarters consisted of a dozen small cabins, arranged in 2 rows, with a central area where cooking fires burned during the day. Now, most of the cabins were dark, their occupants seeking what rest they could before dawn brought another day of labor. A few people still sat outside, enjoying the cooler night air. Old Joseph whittled by the light of a small fire, his gnarled hands creating beauty from scraps of wood. Nearby, Sarah mended a shirt, her needle flashing in the firelight. They nodded to Elijah as he passed, but asked no questions about his late return. Curiosity was another luxury not afforded to slaves. He waited until he was safely in the cramped cabin he shared with 5 others before examining Charlotte's gift. The cabin was dark except for the dying embers of the fire. 2 of his cabin mates were already asleep on their pallets, Isaiah, who worked in the stables, and young Marcus, who had been brought up from the fields last month to train as a house servant. The others were still out. Daniel was assigned to the night watch this week, and the twins, James and John, had permission to visit their mother in the field quarters. By the dying embers of the fire, Elijah carefully unfolded the paper to reveal a page torn from a book. The text was dense, the words unfamiliar in their arrangement, though he recognized most individually. Reading had been a dangerous gift from his mother, who had served as a lady's maid to the colonel's first wife. She had learned alongside her mistress as a child and had passed the knowledge to Elijah in secret before being sold away when the first Mrs. Montgomery died. One passage had been underlined with what appeared to be a pencil mark. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Elijah stared at the words, their meaning simultaneously simple and revolutionary. He had heard whispers of this document, the Declaration of Independence, but had never seen the actual words. Reading them now, in the secret darkness of night, he felt something shift inside him, like a door opening to a room he hadn't known existed. Equal. Created equal. The concept was so foreign to the world he inhabited that it seemed to belong to another universe entirely. Yet here it was, written by the same white men whose descendants now owned him, proclaimed as a self-evident truth. The contradiction was staggering. And unalienable rights, rights that couldn't be taken away, couldn't be sold or transferred. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. The words seemed to pulse on the page, alive with possibility and danger. If these rights truly were granted by the Creator, then the entire system of slavery stood in defiance not just of human decency, but of divine will. Young Marcus stirred on his pallet, mumbling something in his sleep. Elijah quickly folded the paper again, suddenly aware of the risk he was taking. Possession of such material could be punished by whipping, mutilation, or death, depending on the master's mood. Teaching slaves to read was illegal in Georgia, as it was throughout most of the South. Knowledge was power, and those in power had no intention of sharing it. On his pallet, surrounded by the sleeping forms of others whose lives were not their own, Elijah made a decision that would alter everything. In the morning, he would place 3 stones by the old oak tree. Not because Miss Charlotte had asked, but because for the first time he glimpsed a possibility beyond invisibility. The choice terrified him. Every instinct honed by years of survival screamed against it. To engage with Miss Charlotte was to court disaster. For himself certainly, but potentially for others as well. Punishment on plantations was often collective, a strategy to prevent exactly the kind of individual rebellion he was contemplating. But as he carefully hid the paper beneath a loose floorboard near his sleeping place, Elijah realized that some knowledge, once gained, couldn't be unlearned, no matter how dangerous it might be. The words on that torn page had awakened something that had always existed within him, but had never been given voice. The fundamental understanding that his bondage was not natural, not ordained, not inevitable. He lay awake long into the night, the Declaration's words echoing in his mind. Equal, unalienable rights, self-evident truths. Against these concepts, the elaborate justifications for slavery that he had heard all his life, biblical passages twisted to support oppression, pseudo-scientific theories about racial difference, economic necessities, seemed suddenly hollow, constructed rather than discovered. As he finally drifted toward sleep, Elijah wondered what Miss Charlotte sought from him. Understanding, absolution, or something more. Dangerous alliance? Whatever her reasons, she had given him something precious and volatile. Confirmation that the justice he sensed in his heart was recognized, at least in principle, by the very nation that denied it to him in practice. 3 stones by the oak tree. Such a small act of defiance. Yet in that moment, it felt like the first true choice he had made in his life. Charlotte couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, watching the slave quarters where a few fires still glowed in the darkness. Somewhere among those simple cabins, Elijah was perhaps reading the page she'd impulsively torn from her book of founding documents. An act her father would consider treasonous. The cool night air drifted through her open window, carrying the scent of magnolias and the distant sound of someone playing a fiddle, the notes so faint that they might have been imagined. Her room felt different since her return from Connecticut. smaller somehow, the familiar furnishings now slightly foreign, as if she were seeing them through new eyes. The four-poster bed with its hand-stitched quilt, the vanity with its silver-backed brushes and crystal perfume bottles, the bookcase filled with volumes deemed appropriate for a young lady's education. All of it beautiful, comfortable, and paid for with human suffering. What was she doing? The question echoed in her mind as she pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Her actions weren't just reckless. They endangered someone who had no choice but to be in her presence. The power imbalance was impossible to ignore. Yet she'd initiated this dangerous connection anyway. Was it genuine concern for justice that motivated her, or merely the thrill of rebellion against her father's authority? The question troubled her more than she cared to admit. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The door opened to reveal her sister Catherine, pale in her white nightgown, her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders in a way their mother would never permit during the day. "Kitty," Charlotte whispered, using the childhood nickname. "You should be resting. Mother said you have a fever." Catherine closed the door quietly behind her and crossed to sit on Charlotte's bed. At 14, she still possessed the gangly awkwardness of adolescence, though her face promised future beauty. In the dim light of the bedside lamp, she looked younger than her years, vulnerable in a way that made Charlotte's heart ache. "I'm perfectly well," she confided, plucking at the lace trim of her nightgown. "I just couldn't bear to sit through dinner with Thomas Wilkes staring at you like you're a prize mare at auction." Despite her anxiety, Charlotte smiled. Her sister had always been perceptive, though she usually hid her sharp observations behind a facade of girlish compliance. "When did you become so perceptive?" "While you were away." Catherine picked at the embroidery on Charlotte's quilt, tracing the pattern of intertwined roses with one finger. "Things changed here, Lottie. Father is harder now. The slaves are afraid more than before." Charlotte moved to sit beside her sister, taking her hand. Catherine's fingers were cold despite the warm night, and they trembled slightly in Charlotte's grasp. "What happened?" Catherine's eyes darted to the door, her voice dropping further. "There was a slave from the Wilkinsons' place who tried to run away. They caught him in the swamp and brought him back. Father helped with the punishment." "What punishment?" Charlotte asked, though she already knew the answer. Her stomach clenched in anticipation. "They made everyone watch," Catherine whispered, tears filling her eyes. "Even me. Father said I needed to understand how the world works." She swallowed hard, the memory clearly still vivid. "They whipped him until he couldn't stand. Then they cut off part of his foot so he couldn't run again. He screamed until he couldn't anymore, and everyone just watched." Charlotte pulled her sister close, rage building inside her at the thought of Catherine being forced to witness such brutality. This was the reality her father and men like Thomas Wilkes fought to preserve. A system built on terror and pain, disguised as tradition and necessity. She had read accounts of such punishments in abolitionist literature, but hearing it from her sister's lips, knowing it had happened on neighboring land with her father's participation, made it viscerally real in a new way. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," she said, stroking Catherine's hair, feeling utterly inadequate. What comfort could she possibly offer against such horror? "Would you have stopped it?" her sister asked, pulling back to look at her with an intensity that belied her years. The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Before her time at school, Charlotte would have said no, that their father's word was law, and the punishment of slaves was his right as their owner. She would have turned away, perhaps, unable to watch. but she wouldn't have questioned the fundamental rightness of the system. Now, she wasn't so sure. The Charlotte who had read Emerson and Thoreau, who had attended lectures by Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, who had debated with the daughters of abolitionists, that Charlotte could no longer accept the moral framework of her upbringing. "I don't know," she answered honestly, "but I would have tried to protect you from seeing it." Catherine nodded, seeming older than her years. "Mr. Wilkes wants to marry you. I heard Father discussing it with Mother." The confirmation of what Charlotte had suspected sent a chill through her. Marriage to Thomas Wilkes would be a prison more gilded, but no less confining than those experienced by the slaves they owned. She would be expected to manage his household, bear his children, and turn a blind eye to whatever cruelties he deemed necessary to maintain his position and wealth. "Father can't force me," she said, with more confidence than she felt. Catherine's expression was doubtful. "Can't he? You know what happened to Cousin Rebecca when she refused the match her father arranged." Charlotte did know. Their cousin had been essentially locked away until she agreed to the marriage. All social contact denied until her will broke. She had written to Charlotte once after her wedding, a letter so devoid of her former spirited personality that it might have been written by a stranger. The story was whispered among young women as a cautionary tale. "I won't let that happen," Charlotte promised, though she had no idea how to prevent it. Her father's power over her life was nearly absolute. As an unmarried woman, she had few legal rights and little recourse if he chose to exercise his authority. Her education had opened her mind, but had done nothing to change her legal status. "What will you do?" Catherine asked, her voice small but hopeful. She had always looked to Charlotte for protection, for solutions to problems that seemed insurmountable. Charlotte wished she had an answer that would reassure her sister. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I'm working on it." The 3 stones she hoped to find tomorrow suddenly seemed woefully inadequate against the machinery of oppression that surrounded them. After Catherine returned to her room, Charlotte sat at her writing desk and opened her journal again. By candlelight, she wrote of her evening encounter with Elijah, of her sister's revelations, and of her growing certainty that she could no longer live within the system she'd been raised to accept. "If he places the stones by the oak tree, what then?" she wrote, her pen scratching softly against the paper. "What can I possibly offer except danger? And yet I feel that in these small acts of rebellion, something essential is at stake, not just for us, but for all who live under my father's rule." She paused, considering her next words carefully. If the journal were discovered, it could condemn her, and potentially Elijah as well. Yet she felt compelled to record her thoughts, to make concrete the shifting emotional landscape within her. "I have been taught all my life that this system is natural, divinely ordained, and economically necessary. Yet when I look at Elijah, I see a man of intelligence and dignity, who deserves freedom as much as I do. When I hear Catherine describe the torture of a human being for the crime of seeking liberty, I cannot reconcile it with any God worth worshiping or any economy worth preserving. Perhaps I am naive. My northern friends certainly thought so, with their easy judgments from safe distances. They have not lived with this system, have not loved people who perpetuate it, have not benefited from its comforts while increasingly abhorring its costs. They see only monsters and victims, not the complex humanity on both sides of this divide. Yet their moral clarity has its own power. There are some practices so fundamentally wrong that no context can justify them. Slavery is such a practice. I believe this now with certainty, though I cannot yet see a path forward that doesn't lead to destruction, of my family, of Elijah, perhaps of myself. As dawn approached, Charlotte finally slept, the journal hidden once more beneath her mattress. She dreamed of stones arranged in patterns, of oak trees with roots that stretched across continents, and of Elijah's eyes, the only truly honest thing she'd encountered since returning home. In her dream, the 3 stones transformed into a key, then into a bird that took flight, carrying her words across impossible distances. She followed it through darkness and light, through danger and promise, toward a future she couldn't quite see but could almost touch. A future where Elijah walked beside her not as property, but as a man, where Catherine never again had to witness cruelty in the name of order, where the contradictions that defined her world resolved into something new and true. She woke with tears on her cheeks and the first light of morning streaming through her window. Today she would check the oak tree. Today she would learn if Elijah was willing to risk everything for a possibility neither of them could fully articulate. Today, perhaps, the future would begin to take shape. 3 stones lay at the base of the oak tree. Charlotte stared at them, her breath catching. Elijah had responded. She placed a small book of Blake's poetry beside them, marked with a magnolia petal. As she rose, Lucy appeared. "Miss Charlotte, your mother's looking for you." Charlotte worried the girl had seen the book, but Lucy's cryptic comment, "Some say it remembers when we were all free," suggested understanding rather than threat. That afternoon, Thomas Wilkes invited Charlotte to a concert in Savannah. Despite her reluctance, she was trapped by social obligation. When arrangements were discussed, Charlotte requested Lucy as her traveling companion instead of the more experienced Bessie, intriguing her mother and drawing Wilkes's shrewd attention. That night, Charlotte returned to the oak tree and found a note where her book had been. Suddenly, Elijah emerged from the shadows. "Mr. Wilkes has men watching the property," he warned. "He wants something from your father, something more than your hand." A noise in the darkness forced them to part quickly. Back in her room, Charlotte read Elijah's note. "There are others who seek what you seek. The old church in Savannah still hosts congregations of a different kind." Ask Lucy about her grandmother's stories. The declaration speaks of truths we hold close. But there are older truths in these lands, carried in blood and song. 3 stones mark the beginning. 7 mark the path forward. Charlotte burned the note, realizing Elijah was connected to an organized resistance. The journey to Savannah now represented not just an ordeal, but an opportunity to connect with others fighting against slavery. For the first time since returning home, Charlotte felt purpose taking shape. Whatever awaited in Savannah, she would face it with open eyes and a resolute heart. The journey began at dawn, dew still clinging to the grass as servants loaded Charlotte's trunk onto Thomas Wilkes's carriage. It was an elegant conveyance, polished mahogany panels and brass fittings that caught the morning light, leather seats soft as butter, and a matched pair of bay horses that pranced with barely contained energy. Like everything associated with Wilkes, it spoke of wealth carefully displayed. Charlotte stood on the front steps, watching Lucy direct the placement of her belongings with surprising authority for one so young. The girl had arrived at her room before sunrise, helping her dress with quiet efficiency. There had been no opportunity to ask about her grandmother's stories. "You look lovely," her mother said, adjusting Charlotte's bonnet. "Remember to be gracious to the Prestons. Their connections in Savannah society are invaluable." "Yes, Mother." Charlotte's replies had become automatic, a shield behind which her true thoughts remained hidden. Catherine appeared, still in her nightgown despite their mother's disapproval. "I wish I could go with you," she whispered as they embraced. "Next time," Charlotte promised, though both knew such an invitation was unlikely. Catherine was still considered too young for formal society. Her father emerged from the house, Thomas Wilkes at his side. The two men had been closeted in the study since breakfast, their voices occasionally rising enough to suggest disagreement, though the words themselves remained indistinct. "Everything is in order," the colonel announced. "Mr. Wilkes has assured me you'll be well chaperoned at all times." His gaze held a warning Charlotte understood perfectly. Any behavior that might jeopardize this developing connection would have consequences. "Of course, Father." She forced a smile. "Mr. Wilkes has been most considerate." Wilkes bowed slightly. "It is my pleasure to introduce Miss Montgomery to Savannah's cultural offerings." His voice was smooth, practiced, revealing nothing of whatever tension had existed in the study. "The carriage is comfortable, but we should depart if we hope to reach the Parkers' plantation by nightfall." The Parkers. Not a direct journey to Savannah, then, but an intermediate stop. Charlotte hid her surprise, having assumed they would travel straight to the city. This change meant another night under scrutiny before reaching their destination. As Wilkes handed her into the carriage, his fingers lingered on hers a moment too long. "I've looked forward to our conversations, Miss Montgomery. Your father speaks highly of your education." Lucy climbed in after her, settling on the forward-facing seat across from Charlotte, while Wilkes took his place beside Charlotte. The proximity was uncomfortable, but proper enough, the open carriage visible to anyone they passed. With a flick of the driver's whip, they pulled away from Montgomery Hall. Charlotte turned to wave at her family, catching a glimpse of Elijah standing in the shadows of the side entrance. His face revealed nothing, but she felt the weight of his gaze as the carriage rounded the drive and headed toward the main road. "Your maid seems young," Wilkes observed once they were underway. "I would have expected someone more experienced for such a journey." "Lucy is quite capable," Charlotte replied, "and eager to learn." Lucy kept her eyes downcast, the picture of deference, though Charlotte noticed how the girl's attention seemed to catch on everything: the contents of Wilkes's pockets, the papers in his portfolio, the way his driver navigated the road. "Youth has its advantages," Wilkes conceded, "though experience brings wisdom." He turned slightly toward Charlotte. "Your father mentioned you've developed some progressive ideas during your time in Connecticut." The statement hung in the air, both question and challenge. Charlotte considered her response carefully. "Education broadens one's perspective," she said neutrally. "Miss Porter's curriculum is quite comprehensive." "Indeed. Though I wonder if Northern educational institutions present a balanced view of our Southern institutions." His tone remained conversational, but Charlotte sensed the trap being laid. "They present multiple perspectives," she replied. "As my father taught me, understanding all sides of an argument is essential to forming sound judgments." Wilkes smiled, apparently pleased with her diplomatic answer. "Your father is a wise man, though currently troubled by financial concerns that might have been avoided with more prudent management." So that was it. Her father's financial difficulties were more severe than he'd acknowledged. And Wilkes knew it, perhaps even intended to use that knowledge. "All plantations face challenges," Charlotte said carefully. "Cotton prices fluctuate, and last season's rains affected many in the county." "True enough, but those with diversified interests weather such storms more easily." He gestured toward the fields they were passing, another plantation's land. The slaves bent low over the rows of cotton. Your father's generation focused primarily on land and labor. The future belongs to those who understand the broader economy: banking, railroads, manufacturing. Charlotte followed his gaze to the field workers. Even from a distance, she could see the overseer on horseback, whip at the ready. The casual brutality of the scene contrasted sharply with Wilkes's talk of economic progress. "And what of those whose labor creates this wealth?" she asked, unable to entirely suppress her true feelings. "Do they have no place in this future you envision?" Something flickered in Wilkes's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at her directness. "Their place is secured by the very system that provides for all of us," he replied smoothly. "The natural order places each person according to their capabilities. Some lead, others follow. Some plan, others execute. It has been thus since civilization began." From her seat across from them, Lucy's eyes briefly met Charlotte's. Though the girl's expression remained carefully blank, Charlotte sensed a current of thought behind the mask. "Yet civilizations evolve," Charlotte countered, keeping her tone light despite the seriousness of the subject. "Ancient Rome once considered slavery natural, as did Greece. Their greatest philosophers defended it. Now we look back and recognize their moral blindness on this issue, even as we admire their achievements in other areas." Wilkes studied her with new interest. "You speak like a debater, Miss Montgomery. I find that unexpected. Most young ladies prefer less contentious topics of conversation." "My apologies if I've given offense," Charlotte said, though she felt no regret. "As you noted, my education may have been unusual." He laughed, seemingly genuinely amused. "No offense taken. In fact, I find your mind stimulating. So many young women are educated merely in superficial accomplishments. A little music, a little French, enough literature to manage drawing room conversations. But substance, that is rare and valuable." His apparent approval unsettled Charlotte more than criticism would have. She had expected resistance to her ideas, not this strange appreciation that felt somehow more dangerous. The conversation shifted to safer topics as the morning progressed. Books they had read, music they enjoyed, mutual acquaintances in Savannah society. Wilkes proved knowledgeable and articulate, making Charlotte uncomfortably aware that in different circumstances she might have found him an interesting companion. Around midday, they stopped at a roadside inn for refreshment. While Wilkes spoke with his driver, Charlotte seized the opportunity to question Lucy as they washed the dust from their faces in the inn's small side room. "Your grandmother's stories," Charlotte whispered. "Elijah suggested I ask you about them." Lucy's hand stilled in the basin. "My grandmother knew many stories, Miss Charlotte." Her voice was barely audible. "Some about the old church in Savannah, some about the underground." The word hung between them. The Underground Railroad, the secret network that helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North. Charlotte had read about it in abolitionist pamphlets, but hearing it referenced so directly by someone who clearly had personal knowledge made her heart race. "Could you tell me?" The door opened before she could finish her question. A serving girl entered with fresh towels, ending their private conversation. When they resumed their journey, Wilkes produced a small volume of poetry from his coat pocket. "I thought you might enjoy this," he said, offering it to Charlotte. "Tennyson's latest. I find his work speaks to our modern condition while honoring traditional values." Charlotte accepted the book with genuine interest. "Thank you. I admired In Memoriam greatly. A beautiful exploration of faith tested by grief," Wilkes agreed, "though I prefer his more structured works. The Lady of Shalott, for instance. There's something appropriate about a woman who is destroyed when she abandons her prescribed role to pursue the wider world. Don't you think? The message couldn't have been clearer had he stated it directly. Charlotte felt a chill despite the warm afternoon sun. "I've always seen it as a tragedy that she was confined to viewing life through a mirror," she replied, never experiencing reality directly, yet safe in her tower until she chose otherwise. His smile remained pleasant, but his eyes had hardened slightly. "We all have our towers, Miss Montgomery. Positions that protect us even as they define our limitations." The remainder of the day's journey passed in similar verbal sparring, each exchange reinforcing Charlotte's understanding that Thomas Wilkes was far more perceptive and potentially more dangerous than she had initially believed. He was testing her, measuring her responses against some standard she couldn't quite discern. By late afternoon, the landscape had changed. The road winding through pine forests, occasionally broken by sweeping plantations. The air grew heavier with humidity as they approached the coastal region, carrying the faint scent of salt marsh and river water. "We're nearly there," Wilkes announced as they turned onto a tree-lined avenue. Parker's Rest is one of the oldest plantations in the county. James Parker's grandfather received the land grant from King George himself. The house that emerged at the end of the avenue was impressive. A 3-story structure with massive columns and wide verandas, surrounded by ancient live oaks draped with Spanish moss. Unlike Montgomery Hall's more restrained architecture, Parker's Rest embraced the grandeur of Greek Revival style, a monument to wealth accumulated over generations. Servants appeared as the carriage approached, moving with the choreographed precision that spoke of rigid discipline. Charlotte noticed Lucy straightening her dress, adjusting her posture to match the formality of their surroundings. "Remember," Charlotte whispered as Wilkes was handed down from the carriage. "Observe everything." Lucy nodded almost imperceptibly as a tall, silver-haired man descended the front steps to greet them. "Thomas, right on time as always." James Parker's voice boomed across the drive. "And this must be Miss Montgomery. Welcome to Parker's Rest, my dear. We've heard so much about you." As Charlotte offered her hand and her practiced smile, she wondered exactly what he had heard, and from whom. The web of connections surrounding her seemed to grow more complex with each passing hour. The evening that followed was a blur of introductions and carefully managed conversations. The Parkers had assembled a small dinner party in her honor, local gentry whose names Charlotte dutifully committed to memory, while revealing as little of herself as possible. She played her role perfectly, the well-bred young lady with just enough education to be interesting without being threatening. Only once did she falter, when dinner conversation turned to a recent slave uprising on a neighboring island. "Terrible business," Mrs. Parker declared, her diamonds catching the candlelight as she gestured emphatically. 3 white families murdered before the militia restored order, and after all they'd done for those ungrateful creatures. "What provoked the uprising?" Charlotte asked before she could stop herself. A momentary silence fell over the table. James Parker recovered first. "Provoked? My dear Miss Montgomery, one doesn't seek rational explanations for such savagery. These incidents occur when discipline grows lax and dangerous ideas are permitted to spread." His gaze shifted meaningfully to Wilkes. "As some of us have long argued, precisely why stronger enforcement of existing laws is essential," Wilkes agreed smoothly, "particularly those regarding literacy and assembly." Charlotte felt the conversation shifting around her, moving into territories where her presence was suddenly inconvenient. She recognized the subtle signals passing between the men: the raised eyebrow, the slight nod, The deliberate change of subject. "Miss Montgomery, I understand you play the pianoforte." Mrs. Parker interjected. "Perhaps you would favor us after dinner." And just like that, Charlotte was relegated to the feminine sphere of accomplishments while the men prepared to discuss matters of substance. It was a familiar pattern, one she had observed her entire life without truly recognizing its purpose. Now she understood it as another form of control, a way of maintaining separate worlds where women remained ignorant of men's true concerns. Later, as she played Chopin for the assembled guests, Charlotte watched Wilkes, Parker, and two other men withdraw to the library, closing the door behind them. Whatever they discussed remained private, but when they emerged an hour later, the tension in Wilkes's shoulders suggested the conversation had not gone entirely to his satisfaction. When Charlotte finally retired to her assigned bedroom, she found Lucy waiting to help her undress. The girl moved efficiently, removing pins from Charlotte's elaborate hairstyle and unlacing her corset with practiced hands. "What did you observe?" Charlotte asked quietly once the door was securely closed. Lucy's expression remained neutral, but her voice carried urgency. "The house slaves here are afraid, Miss Charlotte. More afraid than at Montgomery Hall. And there's talk of slave catchers being hired, not just for runaways, but for something else." "What else?" "Don't know for certain." Lucy began brushing out Charlotte's hair with long, smooth strokes. "But I heard the cook say Mr. Parker and the others are worried about organizers coming up from Savannah, people who spread dangerous ideas." Charlotte met Lucy's eyes in the mirror. "Like the ideas my book of poetry might contain?" A ghost of a smile touched Lucy's lips. "Exactly like that, Miss Charlotte." She hesitated, then added, "My grandmother worked in this house before being sold to your family. She knew all its secrets, including which floorboards don't creak and which windows can be opened from the outside." The implication was clear. Lucy's knowledge wasn't coincidental. She had been chosen specifically for this journey, perhaps by Elijah, perhaps by others involved in whatever resistance existed. "Is there something I should know about our visit to Savannah?" Charlotte asked directly. Lucy's brush paused mid-stroke. "The old church Elijah mentioned. It's not just a meeting place. It's a station on the road north. And there's a meeting 2 nights from now." She lowered her voice further. "Important people are coming. People who could help many others find freedom." Charlotte's mind raced with implications. The organizers Parker and Wilkes feared must be connected to the Underground Railroad. And somehow, improbably, she had become entangled in their operations. "How can I help?" The question emerged before she had fully considered its consequences. Lucy studied her face, as if measuring her resolve. "First, by watching and listening. Mr. Wilkes and these men, they're planning something that has the quarters in terror. Second," she hesitated, "by being ready when the time comes to make a choice." "What choice?" "Between the world you were born to and the world that could be." Lucy resumed brushing, her face once again carefully composed. "My grandmother always said that when the moment comes, you'll know it. And that moment changes everything after." Charlotte lay awake long after Lucy had gone, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling of Parker's Rest. Outside her window, she could hear the night sounds of the plantation, distant singing from the slave quarters, the call of whippoorwills from the surrounding forest, the occasional bark of dogs patrolling the grounds. Thomas Wilkes wanted her hand in marriage, but clearly had designs on her father's land as well. James Parker and his associates feared some kind of organized resistance among the enslaved population. And somewhere in Savannah, People risked their lives to guide others to freedom. Where did she belong in this complex web of interests and ideals? The Charlotte who had left for Connecticut 2 years ago would have accepted her prescribed role without question. Marriage to a suitable man, management of his household, children raised to continue the traditions of their class. The path had been clear, if narrow. Now she saw options where before she had seen only obligations. Dangerous options that could lead to ostracism, hardship, or worse. Yet the alternative, returning to willful blindness, seemed increasingly impossible. As sleep finally claimed her, Charlotte's last coherent thought was of Elijah's note. 7 stones mark the path forward. She had found 3 at the oak tree. 4 more remained, 4 more steps toward a decision that would define the rest of her life.